global South countries on the whole give more to the world economy in terms of natural resources, energy, labor, land, than they receive back from it. And this is an inequality that has been called unequal exchange. But we can also say it's unequal ecological exchange because in the process, their resources are also being drained and environmental harm is being left behind. So if we take this all together, we really see that extraction not only illustrates the ecological harms and unsustainability of global capitalism, but it also kind of condenses centuries of power relations, as we've just said, and shows the different ways in which they can be reproduced over time if there isn't a countervailing force.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Thea Riofrancos. Thea is an associate professor of political science at Providence College, and she's the author of multiple books, including her most recent, Extraction: The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. Thea joins me today to discuss her research, explaining how and why extractive frontiers come to be, the history of extractivism and its relationship to colonialism, the extractive frontiers that are now being opened up in the global north, which marks a resurgence of resource nationalism as the global south flexes its newfound political muscle with the help of China. She explains the conflict that surrounds extraction, how it breeds inequalities, both between countries and within populations, the economic interventions that are currently underway that are transforming how resources are being extracted, and the wave of resistance that is surging to meet this incredible force, marking yet another difference of our moment in history, which is that people all around the world are better connected, better informed than ever before. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who keep the project going every week. Thea, welcome to Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
Now, I've asked you to come on to discuss your latest book, which is all about extractivism and green capitalism, and particularly the impact of mining. And this is so important because still amongst, mainstream climate circles today, we will see the energy transition being uncritically pushed as the solution to all of the world's ills. And as you point out, that is just not the case. But I'd like to start at the beginning, and this is what I particularly enjoyed about your work, which was that you went right back and you spoke about how mining essentially has been at the heart of capitalism and colonialism since the very beginning, since about 500 years ago. So could we begin there and you could explain to us, what is this connection between capitalism as we understand it and mining historically?
It is a deep connection, and it's one that I couldn't ignore in my own field work. Like, even if I hadn't had some of that history already in my brain, when you go to what I call extractive frontiers around the world, what you tend to discover is that there's a really long history and set of processes that unfolded oftentimes over centuries that molded and shaped these places as extractive frontiers. And if you kind of, not to get into the inevitable mining metaphors, but, I'll go with it. If you kind of dig deeper, why was this place slated for the extraction of this mineral? Why was this ecology and water system considered disposable in the name of some other goal? Why was this population not afforded full rights of self-determination and participation in decisions that will radically change their landscapes, their livelihoods, their social fabric. If you just keep asking why, you actually tend to get into the past, and you tend to get into processes that have, as I said, unfolded over long time scales and in a way sedimented into their own set of structures that are difficult but by no means impossible to upend and transform. And, I think that maybe I'll start with some of the tropes of how colonial and imperial powers framed these places that became extractive landscapes. I think they're going to sound quite familiar today. And then I can say a bit more about the history of capitalism and resource extraction. One of the most common and oldest tropes is the idea of a terra nullius. And this was one that I encountered in Latin America, in the southwestern United States, in the Iberian Peninsula of Europe, which are the three places that this book travels in order to look at what lithium mining is doing on the ground and how it's being contested. And so time and again, whether I was looking at a 17th or 16th century colonial chronicle, meaning the narratives that were produced alongside colonialism to kind of explain back in Europe what these colonizers and conquistadores were doing in, for example, Latin America, you see this repeated claim that nobody lives here. It would be impossible to sustain life here. It's so awful to be here. And so there are all these disparaging claims, which might make it seem like these places are unimportant. But instead, the disparaging claims are doing justificatory work in justifying colonization, justifying the grab of resources by saying that these places are unimportant except for the resources they contain.
Right.
And I then saw almost the same language in the mid-20th century, in a moment when actually the relationship between imperialism and resource extraction was being contested by the global South, but yet global North powers were kind of reiterating, and global North corporations, very similar languages as they went again searching the world for new resources, and then span up to the present in corporate communiques and investor relations kind of presentations that I would use for data. I saw corporations say almost the same thing, that nobody lives here, or that the natural, flora and fauna is not very important. There actually aren't a lot of species here. Or there's not much in the way that we might impact in terms of a habitat or water system. Or this liquid that happens to have lithium in it is not even water, so we don't have to care about it. And so there's, this kind of repeated set of claims that erase the socio-natural landscapes and the pre-existing livelihoods and meanings that are attached to the land. And those have a very old history. And the reproduction of those discourses and ideologies over time is a clue that there are these deep processes at work. And so maybe just to answer your question a bit more directly, but I think, having these kind of words and framings in mind is helpful in terms of why would I even have the intuition that there's a deeper kind of colonial or imperial relationship between capitalism and resource extraction. And so when you zoom out and look at the history of capitalism, which you can periodize in any number of ways, and of course scholars can argue endlessly about when did capitalism begin, how did it begin, why did it begin? But I think one clear through line is the globalizing aspect of capitalism, the fact that capitalism, because of its model of accumulation being profit-oriented and growth-oriented, constantly seeks new places on Earth, whether to acquire resources, to acquire cheap or coerced labor, or to acquire new consumer markets, often all three, but depending on the place, there might be a specific priority. So capitalism is unique among economic systems in that it has this globalizing kind of planetary remit. And that you can see from very early on in the history of capitalism in the 1500s, the 1600s, during what was the beginnings of colonial conquest of the Western Hemisphere by European powers. And you see it again a few hundred years later, maybe at its apotheosis in certain ways, in the late 19th and early 20th century, during the high mark of what we call more properly imperialism. That was a more systemic set of economic and political processes by which European powers, and then kind of joined by the new kid on the block, the United States, colonized not only the Western Hemisphere, but into the interior of Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, et cetera. And, in each moment of this process of imperialism, we could get really granular about what drew a specific power to a specific place. And I don't want to flatten history, but you do see the relevance of critical resources, of energy resources, of mineral resources, and to maybe a lesser but important extent, agricultural resources and water and other natural resources as being a critical part of the story as to why particular places were colonized and why those places remained relegated to an extractive position in the world economy, which is, in general, the least pleasant position to occupy.
I don't think it is flattening history, to take a resource lens and begin to find the same pattern everywhere. Because we know this, right? We know that economies demand a material throughput. We know that they demand an energy input. We know that that sort of defines economies, then that defines economic GDP, and all of these concepts that we consider immaterial are actually, of course, material. And when you pair that back and you look further back when we were dealing with like smaller states or even warring tribes, I mean, that is also over resources, the best lands, the best waters, the best females, whatever it is, the best herds. And so the more access that people have to energy surplus, defined by access also to materials, the bigger they are able to grow and the more that they are able to dominate those around us. And I have found since doing this work, I find it such a useful lens through which to examine history and begin to make sense of all of these tales that are so often defined ideologically. And especially today when we are seeing increasingly what look like ideological wars take up all around the world. But in fact, it's still for resources, no matter what the MAGA hat Trumpians are doing in the White House. Ultimately, they can say that it's for a divine providence for God or for whatever it is to keep the Muslims out, but they're going after hard resources. In Israel, in Gaza, going after hard resources. Russia, in Ukraine, going after hard resources. For me, it makes sense of things.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that, perhaps what I meant there by flattening was less that there's really any case in which material resources and economics and political economy are irrelevant to power relations. I mean, I completely agree with you that it's really impossible to understand how the world operates without looking at these quite material interactions with nature and very material power relations between groups of humans. But I do think that there is a tendency to write out some of the contestation and the politics that often attends those interactions, and to maybe with an intent of critiquing power and kind of dismantling it and deconstructing it, sometimes we maybe reproduce the idea that all a place is its oil, or all a place is its copper. And we almost take on unwittingly the view of the corporation or the empire and seeing a place exactly in those terms. And so it's less to kind of take away from the quite material motivations for these operations of power and the kind of historical process of constructing capitalism over time, and more to say that when we look closely, there's a lot more to an extractive landscape than what we've already described. There is forms of interesting political and social agency. There's ways in which resource extraction is never a guaranteed fait accompli, but something that needs to be built through these operations of power, which itself can face pushback, whether from local communities in a more grassroots sense, or sometimes because of competing imperial powers that don't have the exact same aims or political projects, or even sometimes you find tensions between different profit-oriented corporations that have different business models or approaches to profitability. And so I think my invitation is to say, let's both understand this grand sweep of history and these kind of, baseline points about the relationship between economic structure and material throughput, for example, But let's also attend to the very unexpected forms of politics and contention, because that's not only interesting and gives us a more exhaustive story, but I think is the starting point for understanding how we might transform these relations. It's through how they are politically mediated and contested rather than, a natural fact that some places are always going to be sacrifice zones.
Interesting. And I suppose, if I may, those two things could be defined, those two frames, as a relational frame, one which understands all of the interconnections that make life happen and make life possible between human beings and more than human kin. And then just an
Mm-hmm.
extractive lens, the lens that a company takes looking at a place, or a government that can say, a foreign government that can say that land there is terra nullius, nothing lives on it and nothing owns it, even though it's teeming
Mm-hmm.
with life, and oftentimes teeming with human beings as well, like in the case of Australia, which I think is perhaps the most famous and most abhorrent case of terra nullius that we
Yeah.
have in recent centuries.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, just to say something about the first part of your question there, it is something that's difficult in studying these extractive sectors, because there's a real impulse to, first of all, see everything through the lens of extraction, and second of all, to believe that history is merely reproducing itself. And this is oftentimes a question that I pose to groups or community members when I do public events. Do we just think that the energy transition is a green face on colonialism, a green face on colonial capitalism, and that by that token, nothing is changing? Like, it's just as if history were a set of well-oiled gears that is constantly kind of moving in the same direction. And I think that there's something to that. I think that, as I started out in answering your first question, that, when I went to Chile, to the Atacama Desert, where a fifth of global lithium supply comes from, I learned quite quickly about the prior eras of resource extraction and the ongoing multiple sectors of extraction that happen in the same exact place, right? So we had the historical sector of salt nitrate mining. We have gold and silver. We have copper, which then became Chile's huge mining sector, and Chile's the number one copper producer on Earth. Copper exists across hundreds of years, and then lithium is added to the mix. And now Chile is the world's number two producer of lithium. And I could say similar things about the Southwest United States, where in an unexpected way, my research took me. Initially, this book was really just going to be about Latin America, but I ended up doing some research on extractive frontiers within the global North, which itself is a whole interesting thing to ask. Why are global North governments intent on extracting closer to home rather than doing the more typical imperial colonial thing, which is offshoring the stuff as much as possible? But regardless, in Nevada, that is also a place where we have centuries of dispossession of indigenous land. We have really harmful processes of uranium mining, also of nuclear testing, of other types of mining, which have been unremediated. On top of that now is this, newer expansion in the lithium industry. So these layers go very deep, and it's very tempting to just say Nevada has been and will always be a site of indigenous dispossession and resource extraction, or Chile, northern Chile, the same. But, again, sort of what I discovered is that at each of these moments, there was a critical juncture. There was a path not taken. There were other political or economic projects that were contesting this dominant extractivist paradigm. And if we want, if we have any hope of transforming extractivism, then I think learning both about the history of extraction and capitalism, but also the history of how that's been radically contested, is really important to understand right now in this particular moment.
I completely agree with you. And I think what's so interesting about taking this focus on extractivism and dealing with it as a thing in and of itself, rather
Mhm.
than just sort of blaming capitalism, and when I say that, I mean only capitalism. I think that's so important because you could have an extractive socialist order, you could have an extractive communist order, you could have Extractivism could underpin any economic order. It's not just the fact of unlimited growth that is the problem within capitalism. It's the means by which we achieve that. It's the means by which we achieve quote unquote development. And so I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about that, actually, because you talk about this in the book, about this connection between underdevelopment and the resource curse. So when colonial governments and when foreign companies are typically coming in, these Western powers, to extract, what else are they taking out when they take out the guts and the blood of the earth?
Yeah. So, I think that there's a couple of ways to answer that question. One is very localized, like what else gets disrupted by the process of resource extraction in the local environment, in the local society. And then another is maybe zooming out to a bigger economic scale that is more planetary. And so I'll try to answer both of those.
Right.
Mining is, according to scientists, environmental scientists, geologists that study the physical process of mining, is an irreversible form of landscape change. It is not really possible to put the earth back together after you've dug a 2 kilometer, deep hole in the ground or a multiple kilometer pit wide. There's, a few specific reasons for that, other than it might sort of be fairly intuitive that that's a kind of hard process to undo. But even more specifically, mining is always about getting a subset of an economically valuable resource out of surrounding rock that is considered unvaluable for the purposes of economic production. Or in the case of some of the lithium reserves that I look at, they are, as I already mentioned briefly, liquid deposits, but the same applies to lithium that is a brine deposit, where you're getting a subset, the lithium concentration out of it versus the rest of the surrounding brine water. And so your extraction means what it literally says. You're extracting a subset of what exists. But in the process, you have to dig everything else up to get at it, right? And there are different ratios and concentrations of how much copper there is versus surrounding rock. But the more surrounding rock there is, the more waste you are immediately producing. And this is physical waste that, just by laws of nature, you can't disappear something. It's just you can transform maybe the form that it takes. You can physically contain it, but you can't just make the fact that there were rocks there disappear. So what ends up happening is you pile up piles of this waste rock. And sometimes, due to the nature of extraction or the nature of what's underneath the Earth's crust, the rocks are not just solid. There might be some sludgy, more liquidy material as well, which means you kind of have an unwieldy waste pile that's a mix of sludge and rock that now you have to do something with. What's typically done is what's called a tailings basin or a tailings pond or a tailings stack. These are roughly synonymous. Tailings just means what's left over from mining. And those are stacked or contained or put in some kind of basin, and people cross their fingers and hope that it doesn't breach the container. Because if it breaches the container, then you have an avalanche potentially, which can kill people or pose serious threats. You have also just constant leaching of potential contaminants that might be in the chemicals that were used in the extractive process, or they might just merely be what naturally occurs under the earth, but once it oxidizes, it produces a reaction, and then, the soil or water and humans and animals would not really like to ingest that thing, even if it's natural. And so, on a basic level, you are and I take this terminology from a wonderful author, Gabrielle Hecht, you are turning the earth inside out. You are inverting the earth, and you are creating enormous piles of waste, which are quite difficult to contain. And actually, over time, meaning as we move into the present, it's actually gotten worse. We have had more failures and more safety risks posed by these unwieldy stacks of waste. We could sort of keep going with some of the localized impacts, but I'll just name a couple of more that I think are worth understanding, because they help us also understand why mining is so conflictual locally.
Yeah.
Another is water, and there's two issues with water that we should disambiguate, even if they both happen simultaneously. One is that mining uses a lot of water, because mining processes often need water to process the rock, to sometimes inject the water to loosen things. They need water for all manner of their physical operations. And so they're a big consumer of fresh water. The case of copper is key here. Copper is an enormous consumer of fresh water in order to process the copper. But in addition to using water, they also contaminate water by the means through which I already said, with the waste piles, but also through other mechanisms as well. So you're using water, you're contaminating water. And just maybe one more to name, and these can be all kind of interrelated, is an impact on biodiversity. That can happen through a few different ways. You can just have the sheer fact of the physical footprint of the mine displacing whatever habitat previously existed, or the noise and light pollution and, massive trucks driving by with huge, piles of mineral oil, or that they're taking out of the mine. All of that obviously disrupts, species, normal daily lives that they would like to be going about. And so there's a variety of ways that biodiversity is lessened, but I saw this very directly in the case of the Atacama Desert, where I did the research on lithium mines, though we've seen reductions in flamingo populations, for example. And flamingos are endemic to the area. They're really quite beautiful, charismatic species, as we like to say. And so they are suffering from the advent of growth of lithium mining in Chile. So those are a bunch of localized environmental effects. I think it's fairly clear that those have social impacts, whether it's because your community or society deeply values biodiversity and the existing water system and ecological systems, whether it's because your livelihood, perhaps small-scale farming, perhaps ecotourism, whatever it is not viable with these major disruptions to the landscape. Or perhaps more nefariously, it's because of the way the mining company and perhaps a supportive government has treated your community, has not respected the rights of your community to have a say in this process, has actually repressed people when they try to dissent, has maybe even meted out quite violent harm against community members when they try to get more active and involved in contesting the mine. So there's a whole array of ecological and social impacts. But I want to say one other thing in relation to your question, because you asked, what are they taking from the place, and kind of also what gets left behind out of this process. And I think another way to think about this is to zoom out to a more global scale and just mention the empirical fact, which is that global South countries on the whole give more to the world economy in terms of natural resources, energy, labor, land, than they receive back from it. And this is an inequality that has been called unequal exchange. But we can also say it's unequal ecological exchange, because in the process, their resources are also being drained and environmental harm is being left behind. So if we take this all together, we really see that extraction not only illustrates the ecological harms and unsustainability of global capitalism, but it also kind of condenses centuries of power relations, as we've just said, and shows the different ways in which they can be reproduced over time if there isn't a countervailing force.
You just painted a very distressing picture of what mining does. And having walked through a mine in Latin America, I can tell you everything that you're saying is absolutely true. And you can feel it on your skin, in your lungs, in your bones as you walk through it, and you feel it in your soul for a couple of weeks afterwards. Now, given everything that you just described, why on earth would we be in a position now where wealthy countries from the minority world, the global north, would be opening up extractive frontiers on their own soil? And how is this connected to this latest and relatively new rush towards resource nationalism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are at a moment in world history where natural resources are again at the kind of forefront of geopolitics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a recurrent theme, as we said, but there are absolutely moments where this is just much more salient. And we can tell the salience in two ways, both of which you've named, but I want to kind of reemphasize them. One is that we have a clear scramble on the part of the great powers to secure access to resources for advanced technologies of a variety of sorts, energy technologies, but also computing technologies and military technology, right? I would say that those are three of the critical drivers for resource extraction right now. So we have a contest between the great powers to secure their access to these resources that are seen as critical for their economies, but also for their geopolitical prestige. in that context, we do see the deployment of relatively novel, in some cases, political tactics to ensure the securing of these resources. That's one set of phenomena, and I'll come back to that. But I want to directly mention the other that you brought up, which is at the same time and interrelated with the different tactics that great powers are using. We also see that global South governments and societies, including so-called emerging economies — I don't always love that term, but I do want to specify that there are some global South governments that govern economies that are growing, that are important, that are large markets in and of themselves. And so we might want to sometimes point to those countries in particular, whether we're looking at Brazil, whether we're looking at Indonesia, of course, China, and I'll come back to that. China, whether is it a great power? Is it a global South? Is it in between, right? It's an interesting question in and of itself. But this is not just a story of the great powers and the powerful governments on earth scrambling. It's also a story of societies that have less wealth, that in many cases were former colonies themselves, also using novel policy tools to try to ensure that they don't, again, become relegated to this really unfortunate and problematic and toxic and economically volatile extractive node of the global economy. So on all sides, we see states taking economic interventions to reshape the way that resources are extracted and secured, and who benefits from them and who pays the cost, and even geographically where that extraction takes place, which it turns out is a very consequential matter. So I'm going to go back a little bit to what the global North and maybe great powers are doing, and bring China in here as well a bit more frontally. So what we see is a development that honestly surprised me, but it interested me enough that I ended up changing what my book was about in a certain way. It was really just going to be a book about Latin America, which would have been fascinating in and of itself, I'm sure. But I was writing this as history was unfolding, in the moment that I saw very clearly that European powers didn't want to just do the old colonial playbook or imperial playbook of getting their resources from elsewhere. And in the words of Jason Moore and Raj Patel, kind of cheapening the labor and nature of other places that they extract from and appropriate from. That was no longer seen as a reliable way to get resources. And instead, what they wanted to start doing was have domestic mines in the case of the US, or we could say regional mines in the case of Europe, since that's a supranational formation of the European Union. And this really puzzled me. I thought, as I've already mentioned, mining is ecologically destructive, it's socially impactful, and both of those are then in turn causes for political conflicts around mine. Why would you want to kind of onshore or reshore, depending on the case, these sectors when it's not per se so hard to import these minerals from elsewhere and let global South countries deal with the problems of extraction? And not only that, but extraction is really just not the most, quote, value added part of the supply chain. That profit and value really concentrates with the technological manufacturing and even with the owning of patents and intellectual property around those technologies. That's way downstream from mining. And so why would you want to expand an economic sector that isn't even so pivotal to profit and value accumulation? And so all of this had me scratching my head, which is what made me actually want to go talk to people in the European Union, in the European Commission, in the US government, in local governments in the US, just to figure out what was going on. And what everyone told me was the same story. And, sometimes you really want to take what elites say with a grain of salt. But I think in this case, they were sort of being relatively honest, which is the reason we're doing this is China.
Yeah.
On the one hand, and relatedly, the degree of turbulence in geopolitics and in markets has Western governments feeling that they can't, quote unquote, rely on the very systems of unequal trade that they themselves created.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's a mix of China being the first viable threat to Western economic primacy perhaps ever. We could debate, was the Soviet Union an economic threat? Most people will say, it's like most historians of the Cold War, that the threat was more political than economic. I mean, we could split hairs, but in the case of China, it's absolutely clear, and no one needs to split hairs, that China's threat is maybe even more primarily economic than political in a certain sense, in the sense that it contests the Western position at the top of these supply chains and the top of the global economy, and even contests the way that the West relates to the rest of the world by offering a different, we could argue, is it better, is it the same, is it worse, but certainly a different modality in which China relates to other global South countries, right? And so that is a major threat to the idea that the West will just be endlessly powerful. And that threat, the first way they responded to that was just by trying to call out China for doing the wrong type of state intervention in their economy. Like, oh, you violated the WTO. You have manipulated markets. You're distorting trade. You're subsidizing industry. These are all no-nos according to neoliberalism. Which is, funny, because a lot of those same tools, some of them have been a bit dormant recently in the West, but they were all critical to the rise of Western capitalism. So they're not novel ideas. They're not even things that China invented on its own. Not to say that China doesn't do unique things, but the idea that you subsidized infant industries, or that you use barriers to trade to let your domestic industry grow, or that the state helps corporations secure raw materials. These are all things that over centuries Western corporations and states did.
And those three things are things that Western states still do today.
Still do. Well, they're doing now. I mean, and so now it's even more hypocritical because, there was a moment where they were just accusing China of obtaining its economic success using the wrong, quote unquote, methods, right? Ignoring the history of the West doing the same. But then they kind of pivoted immediately and just said, okay, well, I guess we need to copy, quote unquote, copy China. And so now it's like a mix of saying that China distorts trade, overly subsidizes domestic firms, et cetera. And also now Western governments really using a quite similar toolkit, but with much less administrative capacity or planning acumen compared to China. Right? Which I think raises interesting and for progressives or leftists, difficult questions around, is there something about China's regime type that allows it to be so effective economically? Would we want a regime type like China's? Is there a way to disentangle China's extreme levels of administrative capacity, scientific expertise, ability to plan for the future from some of the authoritarian features of its regime type? I think these are very interesting questions to debate for another time, perhaps, but I just want to put them on the table. But regardless, Europe and the US are doing some of the same things that they've accused China of doing, right? Which is, just recently, in the past few months, the Trump government in the US has actually bought shares of mining companies to have the US government be a partial owner of mining companies. That looks very much like the state intervening in the economy, right? Or quote unquote state capitalism. But for over a longer time period, over the past decade, dating to Trump's first time in government, starting in 2017 when he was inaugurated, and also Biden's government, the Democratic government that came in between, and now we're back in Trump. But a through line over this past decade has been the U.S. government wanting to incentivize mining of critical minerals within the United States territory, and secondarily in countries that are considered to be allies or friends of the United States. And this is, again, a similar move where they have accused China of dominating supply chains from end to end, but now maybe they are belatedly realizing that the only way to compete in our current geopolitical environment is to also kind of build supply chains in a similar way that China has. Again, I don't think they're doing it as effectively. I don't think they will be as effective. I don't think anytime soon the US or Europe are going to be self-sufficient in their resources, but they are putting enough incentives to corporations through tax breaks, through subsidies, through government loans, through other supportive government policies. And this, again, goes across the political spectrum. It's quite bipartisan in the US to get some lithium mines and rare earth mines and copper mines being built and constructed and, in the coming years in operation in the United States. And so that's a real change. And I really had to grapple with it because, as I said, a few moments ago, It is an empirical fact that the global south is a net provider of raw materials to the world economy. But that does not necessarily mean that the global north governments and companies never want to have resource extraction closer to home. In fact, we have the clear fact that the United States is the world's #1 oil and gas producer, right? So we shouldn't forget that there already are major resource sectors in some global north countries, often for geopolitical reasons. Often those are sectors that are considered geopolitically important. And so, maybe just one other thing to add here, and then I'll say a word about what the global south is up to in this moment, is that, one of the things that this development forced me to rethink is to be more careful and nuanced when I talk about the quote global north versus the global south.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is not to discard these categories, which, as I just said, have an empirical basis in unequal flows of trade and finance. They absolutely do. And so they're empirically valid categories. But they also can cover up a lot of internal difference, diversity, heterogeneity, exploitation, inequality, injustice, meaning the global north is not just a bunch of bankers or wealthy people. In the global north, you have working class people, you have racialized populations, you have immigrants, you have people that are treated unequally on the account of gender or sexuality. You have geographic inequality, right? Eastern Europe's not the same as Western Europe or Central Europe, right? And these inequalities kind of recur at every scale. And so just to remind us, when I went to Nevada, which is like a hot spot for this new onshoring project, there are multiple lithium mines being proposed, being constructed. Nevada is a place where the history of indigenous dispossession is not a history. It's a reality that's being reproduced in this moment, where the scars on the landscape and the toxic legacies and present of extractive operations are clear for all to see. And it's a place where elites are not being affected. It's working class people, it's indigenous people, it's small scale farmers. These are the people that are being affected by extraction. And so I do think this development of bringing mining into the global north makes us think more complexly about inequality within the global north and who actually benefits from resource imperialism. Is it everyone in the global north, or are there certain strata that certainly benefit more than others? And so that was, I think, an important thought for me to have, but it was like a challenging one for me to grapple with initially. One other point I want to make here, and I'm happy to talk more about this if we want, is what the global south is doing. Because just as the global north is trying on novel policy approaches, the global south too is revitalizing a tradition that we can call resource nationalism. And they're trying to rework it for the current moment that we're in. So it's not a pure kind of inheritance or reproduction, but what we can see is that in the 1960s and 1970s, in the global south, or what was then called the third world, there was a growing movement to nationalize resources. A lot of this was around oil, but it also very much touched mining sectors. And you have many examples of resource nationalizations, of state-owned companies, of new contracts with foreign firms to ensure that the global south countries got more out of their agreements. And so this was a process that had gone on since actually the earlier 20th century in Latin America, but by the 60s and 70s, it's kind of becoming in fashion around the world, around the global south, Middle East, Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, all kind of convening or aligning on this idea that it's not enough to just be formally free of a colonial power or of an imperial power. Political emancipation is not sufficient to actually have sovereignty. In order to be sovereign, to have a modicum of self-determination over what happens within the territory of your state, you need economic sovereignty too. And since, as we discussed, resource extraction and other raw material sectors were exactly what tied these countries to an unequal global system, severing that relationship, reasserting state or social ownership over these sectors was a key part of a broader process of decolonization. A lot happened since the 70s and a lot of backlash to that, ranging from military coups to all manner of economic reforms that made those moves more difficult. So we have then many decades in which global South governments are kind of made into, in some cases, a more submissive set of policies that stops short this radical process of regaining economic sovereignty. And so for a few decades, we don't have a lot of this occurring in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. But over the past 10, 20 years, we are in a renewed period of resource nationalism for a variety of reasons that I'm happy to get into. But for now, suffice to say that it's become the case again that global South governments and the societies that they represent are not satisfied with occupying this 500-year-old position in the global economy by just providing, instead of it being resources for an older version of capitalism. Now it's resources for quote unquote green capitalism or digital capitalism or military capitalism, right? And so these new kind of technologies that are again kind of recruiting countries to being resource extractors and resource producers and nothing else other than that has become just actually untenable politically. Not to say it's not still happening, but there isn't political consensus in most of these societies for just providing resources in this manner of unequal exchange for, global supply chains. And instead, what governments want to do generally is quote unquote move up the supply chain, like capture more of those industries and more high-tech aspects of the supply chain within their countries. So, okay, we don't just want to produce lithium, we want to produce batteries, or we want to produce electric vehicles. So that's one way to address this. And, another way, perhaps more radical or perhaps just radical. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to pause you there because
yeah, pause me.
What I would like to sort of challenge there is the assumption that there was ever a consensus to just be the site of extraction and low cost production, essentially. Because as you've already stated, there were a whole host of economic policies that deliberately forced economies into sort of a malnutrition, which prevented them and continues to prevent them to exploit essentially their own resources. Like, I don't know, I'm going to probably name it. Like Niger, I think, for example, is a huge source of oil and gas in the continent of Africa, and in no way can exploit it or refine it itself in order to get more of the profits from the resources that it's pulling up of its own ground. And that's why these foreign companies have to be invited in. So I'm confused as to how that would be different now, because I think there's always been a lack of consensus, essentially, to be at the bottom of the shit pile, economically and politically. And that hasn't necessarily changed now, except that China has come in and offered to finance development in the exchange of minerals and materials, which is how it's managed to get its hands on 85 to 90% of the supply chain for critical raw materials, which is huge. Yes. So I think that there are a couple of ways to answer your question, because I do actually think that there has been a change. And this is based on me working on extraction for, 15 years, I guess. And I say that not to say that in that 15 years things have radically changed, but more that what I've learned in that time has alerted me to some real changes in the ways that communities receive or don't receive mining, and in how like so-called host governments interact with mining companies. So, maybe one or 2 points, and I'll start with the governments. I think that we absolutely see many cases, and it's not uncommon for governments in the global South to either be pliable vis-a-vis the enormous amounts of economic and political pressure that mining companies place on them, right? And so we have to, if we want to say that extraction is really harmful in the global South, and yet there have been 500 years of it, we have to explain that somehow, right? One way to explain it is through like brute military force, the brute force of imperialism. But after the age of decolonization, there just had to be other techniques for, North Africa was no longer literally a French colony. It might have been a French neo-colony, but that itself means that like it's not necessarily pure military conquest or brute force that is enforcing North Africa's position vis-a-vis France, right? There are other means. That can take the form of regulatory capture. So that's kind of where I was going initially, that companies might, through lobbying, through other forms of pressure, through elite networking, kind of make their way into the state such that the state is more pliable from their perspective. But, what you often discover in talking to more centrist or more conservative political actors in the global South is that they can share a neoliberal vision or even a neo-colonial vision of what their
where their countries should sit in the world order, that, the goal of Chile should be to be a mining powerhouse. I mean, there are many proponents of that within the Chilean political system. I don't know that they've all had a chip planted in their brain by U.S. mining companies. The fact is that elites around the world can often share similar positions through, as I said, networking, the kind of orthodoxy of economics, the way it's taught in graduate programs around the world, right? There are all manner of ways that people come to believe these things, but there's no shortage of Global South leaders that have been perfectly happy with reproducing this position over time with maybe minor modifications. So what we see, though, is that there are certain moments. The 1970s was 60s, 70s was one, and the kind of mid 2000s to the present is another. Those are kind of bookends for a middle period of neoliberal globalization and a bit less contestation over these resource sectors. But in the 60s, 70s, and again today, we actually have much more assertiveness, much more ambition, much more Global South leaders that are willing to, at times, take the political risk of saying, we don't like this arrangement anymore, and we're going to ally with other Global South powers to do something about this, right? So you have periods where the contestation is more open and where, in some cases, ordinary people have elected leaders specifically on this promise to say, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to either industrialize and quote unquote develop, so that we're not in this extractive position, or in some cases, there are also environmental commitments, not just around industrialization and development, but also around like we should environmentally regulate and limit these sectors because they're causing such harm to, the natural bounty of our society. And so that's one set of things. That's governments and political elites being empowered for a variety of reasons to more actively contest the regime of extraction. But another, and this is interrelated, is at the community level. And what the academic research bears out, what my own individual research bears out, and what honestly, if you go to mining company conventions, what mining elites will also say is that it's gotten harder and harder to convince local communities that mines are basically a source of economic benefit to them and carry no problems whatsoever, right? Like that proposition is no longer believable to communities. It used to be easier, according to mining companies themselves, when they're talking among themselves in a very elite space. They will just say very clearly, like, we used to be able to get the quote unquote social license to operate, meaning the quiescence of communities to operate. And now it's harder and harder to do that. We need to use more corporate social responsibility in scare quotes tactics. We need to invest more locally. We need to pay some kind of tribute to the environmental issues and talk about how we're going to deal with them. Or else we actually face militant forms of protest that in their frequency, scale, and effectiveness, I would say, are relatively unprecedented historically. Not to say that communities 100 years ago or 200 years ago never pushed back against the harms of mining, whether those were ecological, the safety of workers, public health, impacts of mining. Not to say that it's totally new for communities to be concerned, but it is new how frequently communities are willing to undertake risky forms of political action to oppose mining to court, not even to always renegotiate it, but to actually oppose a mining project and in some cases successfully prevent it from being built. There are many reasons, and I won't detail them all, but I will just mention that the access to information, we're often very critical of the internet because there's so much slop these days and fake news and, AI fabricated videos. But on the whole, it is easier for communities in rural areas where sometimes there isn't major access to research institutions or educational attainment, right, depending where you are, to actually just learn the basics of how this mining project might impact them or how neighboring communities, especially in Latin America, there's often a lot of clustering of protests because communities learn from another community not only what the harms are going to be, but their tactics of resistance and how those were effective in getting a better deal or in opposing the mine altogether. So I think it's fair to say that mining companies are operating in a novel social and political environment in which there is a really lower threshold of acceptance on the part of both host governments and local affected communities.
Interesting. What's really interesting to think about then with just to pull in everything that you've said, including about these extractive frontiers opening up in Western countries, is that it might be there then that we see more of a return to the old style, which was these mines just being pushed through no matter the resistance, as we have seen in the Nevada desert with regards to these lithium mines, because it's Western governments that have what, frankly, they have the most to lose, don't they, with regards to being at the top of the pile. And so it will be state intervention to ensure that these companies can access these lands in order to continue supplying the material resources that are needed to fuel the economy.
Yeah. 100%. And so I think that it's in both the local ecological and indigenous resistance and in this kind of policy toolkit that the global South is using. In part, they too are also inspired by China, and that's an interesting thing to think about. That is changing the politics and economics of mining, but also, I think, opening up new possibilities. I don't want to be overly optimistic because there's a lot to be depressed about. And there's a lot of tragedy unfolding. And as you said, in some cases, communities valiantly rise up and do new things in terms of creating new coalitions, lawsuits, land occupations, just to name all of the different tactics that communities in Nevada have used. And yet the powers are just too aligned against them. And in this case, just to note, and to deepen something I said earlier, both a Republican presidential administration and a Democratic presidential administration, and a powerful mining company and a powerful auto company in the case of General Motors, which is linked to the Thacker Pass project. That's a lot. And then they're also in a state where the state, let's talk about pliant or compliant policymakers. We don't have to go to the global South for that. We have it here in the global North, of course, too, right? So the state of Nevada is famous from the perspective of the mining industry for being a really friendly jurisdiction in their terms. So that is a huge amount for relatively marginalized, low-resource communities that are in some cases in coalition for the very first time, that are mixing together indigenous communities, environmental activists, farmers and ranchers, people that may not have always a lot of background relationship with one another, to go against a bipartisan consensus and a couple of powerful firms. It's a very David and Goliath battle. We see examples of that working in the world. I mean, in Latin America, there's many what we can call stranded assets, meaning mines that may never get built because the opposition was too successful. But we also do sometimes see economic and political alignment among elites that is strong enough to kind of run roughshod over even pretty vibrant and innovative processes of local resistance.
Yeah, thank you for that, Thea. I'm aware that we are now running out of time. So I'm going to ask you what was originally my first question, and I've been playing around with the format recently. Based on everything that you've researched, briefly, why is the world in crisis?
I'm going to give an annoying academic answer to that, which is that I do see it as a polycrisis, as a set of intersecting crises. And I will say that the causes are overdetermined. But I think that the development of capitalism, its relationship to planetary resources, and the evolving geopolitical relationships between countries, and how rapidly all of this is now changing, fueled also by, in some cases, scary forms of technological development. And I'm not talking about lithium batteries. I don't view those as scary, but I'm talking about, both artificial intelligence and military technologies that I do view as pretty nefarious. Okay. I think it's a very combustible combination that is producing what we might call crises as a kind of ongoing and rapid symptom, right, of these deeper structures of the kind of falling apart and of certain elements of capitalism, their own exhaustion as a way to provide any form of economic well-being for masses of people, and also the exhaustion really of a Western-dominated world order. But the West is not going to go down easily. So it's not just that China or the global South or emerging economies are rising to the top and the West is peacefully kind of falling by the wayside. Instead, we're getting tremendous geopolitical competition, which could really result in, I think, more live conflicts as the future goes on. So sorry to maybe paint a bleak picture, but I do think the capitalism the relationship between capitalism and nature, and then the geopolitical arrangement that kind of organizes all of that are all individually in crisis and interacting in unpredictable ways.
All right. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I would love to platform someone who could analyze everything I just said. So it's a great segue. Who's a professor at Cambridge named Ilyas Alami. His work is really on these exact crises, their geopolitical ramifications, and the evolving relationship between the West and China. And he's just amazing, pays a lot of attention to climate and ecology, but comes from a more political economy background, and is just a heterodox economic and political thinker who's awesome.
Brilliant. Could you introduce me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, perfect. Well, Thea, thank you so much for your time today. This has been very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for the super thoughtful questions. It was a pleasure.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.